Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Arguably, the most famous and most often read portion of John Wisdom's article, Gods, is section 6, where he introduces the parable of the invisible gardener. That's not what he actually calls it, but that's what a lot of other people come to call it down the line. And why is he bringing this up? He's, very interested in using examples and analogies. So he's going to use this to illustrate a point, which he summarizes like this. How is it that an explanatory hypothesis, such as the existence of God, may start by being experimental and gradually become something quite different, can be seen from the following story. So, as we've already talked about, John Wisdom in talking about how the atheist and the theist are living in the same world but interpreting it differently. A lot of their arguments or disagreements are not over the facts themselves, but how to interpret it. That pertains more to, let's say, contemporary theists, not theists of ancient times or medieval times when they had a very different cosmology. So Wisdom is going to use this story to illustrate how in the present, or at least in his present, not quite 100 years ago, people could see the same stuff, research things the same way, work with the same information or data, and yet arrive at different conclusions. So, he tells us that two people return to their long-neglected garden, and what do they find there? Among the weeds, a few of the old plants are surprisingly vigorous. One says to the other, it must be a gardener has been coming and doing something about these plants. But what happens then? They start engaging in inquiry. Now, the other person as yet is not yet committed, right? He said, well, okay, maybe there is a gardener. Let's find out. So they ask around, and no neighbor has ever seen anyone at work in their garden. So now, maybe there isn't a gardener. So the first says to the other, well, there's an explanation of this. He must have worked while people slept. And the other is starting to get a bit skeptical. He says, no, somebody would have heard him. And besides, now here's introducing another consideration, anybody who cared about the plants would have kept down these weeds. And then the first person says, well, look at the way these are arranged. There's a purpose and a feeling for beauty here. Now, here we get to the invisible gardener as an explanation. I believe that someone invisible to mortal eyes. I believe that the more carefully we look, the more we shall find confirmation of this. So they examine the garden ever so carefully. And it's rather equivocal. It could go this way or it could go that way. Why? Because they do, in fact, come on new things, suggesting a gardener comes, but sometimes they come on new things suggesting the contrary, that there is no gardener, or even going further, that a malicious person has been at work. So they are observing the facts of the case, they're spending time checking out this garden, and they're finding it could go one of three ways. No gardener, malicious gardener, invisible gardener who likes things to be good, right? Then what do they do some more? Well, they carry out some research. They study what happens to gardens that are unattended, that nobody gives attention to. Each learns, all the other learns about this, and about the garden. So they have all of the relevant information that they could use to arrive at some sort of conclusion and to support the conclusion that they're putting forward, but they're in conflict. One says there is a gardener, the other says there is not a gardener. So when, after all this, one says, I still believe a gardener comes, well, the other says, I don't, what's going on here? Wisdom says their different words now reflect no difference as to what they found in the garden, no difference as to what they would find in the garden if they looked further, because they have looked further, and no difference about how fast untended gardens fall into disorder, because they've looked into that. Now, here's where we come back to the original issue. Wisdom says, at this stage, in this context, the gardener hypothesis has ceased to be experimental. What does that mean? There's no empirical test that either of them could bring forward that would convince the other person, or even if they're wavering, convince themselves. They've looked into everything that's available from a factual, empirical, experiential, or, as to use the word wisdom, employs experimental perspective. Right? So there's something else going on here. And he says that now the difference between one who accepts and one who rejects, this key difference, is not a matter of the one expecting something that the other does not expect. What is the difference between them? Well, we can look at them and say, well, it's a difference in terms, in words, in what they assert. The one says a gardener comes unseen and unheard. He is manifested only in his works, with which we're all familiar. And the other one says there is no gardener. With this difference in what they say about the gardener goes another difference. There's what they say and what they feel. So it's linguistic or semantic, we might say, and it's also affective. It is about their feelings, whether this fills them with awe or dread or happiness or whatever else, right? So he says, this is in spite of the fact that neither expects anything of the garden which the other does not expect. So we could say, well, they just got different takes, different feelings, different ways they want to regard this. Live and let live. It's kind of an aesthetic difference. People have different tastes, different sentiments, not that big of a deal. If one person wants to believe in an invisible gardener or in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or whatever you want, that's fine for them. The other person can believe what they want to believe, not a big deal. And so in this case, questions like, well, which one is right or which one is reasonable might not be appropriate. Maybe it's just a matter of taste. But if we're talking about the universe, the entire cosmos that we live in, and we're talking about the existence of a gardener who we might be tempted to call God or the gods, it's no longer live and let live. And we can ask the questions, well, who is right or which is right, which is reasonable? These are appropriate questions at this point. And so he says, if you think the world's a garden and not a wilderness and the gardener has not forsaken it, or you still think there are nymphs of the streams, a presence in the hills, a spirit of the world, you're making a claim. And he says, perhaps when a man sings gods in his heaven, we don't have to take this as more than an expression of how he feels. But when Bishop Gore or Dr. Joad write about belief in God and young men read them in order to settle their religious doubts, this is not people just choosing exclamations with which to face nature and the chances and changes of this mortal life. They are talking about things as if they are talking about facts, scientific fact or metaphysical fact, right? He says it could be transsensual, trans-scientific, and metaphysical fact, but that is still a matter of fact, and therefore still a matter about which reasons for and against may be offered. So we can intelligently argue, dispute, discuss with each other matters like, is there an invisible gardener, or pick whatever else you want, like a heavenly father, a God who arranges things down here for us, but we don't see him or hear him, but it's still useful to pray to him or her or it or them or whatever it's going to be. We can, in fact, offer reasons which perhaps only express our point of view and won't be convincing to the other, but that doesn't prevent them from being reasons for or against. Scientific reasons won't be particularly helpful. Why not? Because we're experiencing the same world. Now, you could say, well, what about people who think that the world is flat and that God created it like a big tableau? Okay, that's a cosmological matter. You know, a lot of flat earthers, you can't actually convince them of anything because they're essentially conspiracy theorists and they're stuck in their ways, and you can offer them all sorts of scientific evidence that, you know, the world is indeed a slightly irregular globe, and they're not going to believe it. We've got people, you know, who think all sorts of things like that. But we're talking about reasonable people who are amenable to seeing the same things that the rest of us are, even after we've got all the facts, all the information from a scientific perspective, and we make clear our metaphysical commitments, and we're, you know, totally transparent about those, we could still reasonably disagree with each other. Now, he brings up a quip from David Hume in 6.2, right? He says, can the manifestation of an attitude and the utterance of a word and the application of a name have a logic? When all the facts are known, how can there still be a question of fact? How can there still be a question? Surely, as Hume says, after every circumstance, every relation is known, the understanding has no further room to operate. Now, notice the slippage, the shift here. When all the facts are known, how can there still be a question of fact? That's right. Hume is correct about that. How can there still be a question? Hume is wrong about that. We can still have a question. We can still stake out positions. That is what this story is supposed to illustrate to us. Both of the people in this parable are reasonable and engaging in research together and having a discussion and providing more than just feels or vibes or sentiments or whatever else we want to call it for their point of view, even though they don't manage to convince the other person. And, you know, what is the implication of this? Well, when we think about the universe itself and whether there is a God or isn't a God of such a nature as to care about the universe and to tend to it, that is the same sort of difficult to resolve issue where we may differ with another person. We may even differ within ourselves and debate back and forth within our own minds about this. So, very powerful parable, which many people later on will pick up on. This is the part of the essay that tends to make it into philosophy of religion anthologies and to get referenced, although the entire article is very important. And it's supposed to, like a parable, illustrate some sort of point to us.